We live in a world that seems to get more and more divided and polarized every day, whether it's in the political sphere or in the family home. Connecting with people of different values and worldviews is an ongoing challenge. So what do we need to know to break through? Is it even possible? Doug Tataryn is a clinical psychologist and life coach. Nice to have you back in the studio. Good morning, Doug.
It's wonderful to be here. Yeah.
As a psychologist focusing obviously on interpersonal relationships, how much of an issue is this, the inability to connect or communicate with people of different values and perspectives?
It's pretty big. And once I kind of woke up to this dimension, it really made my clinical practice a lot easier because I could understand what was going on with some of my clients and the challenges that they faced. And I want to say that today's topic that we're talking about in terms of the conflict and, in a sense, intergenerational conflict also is a setup for the emotions and feelings that I've been talking about in terms of why are we talking about emotions and feelings now? And because it turns out they're related. And I actually asked Bruce when I was coming in here, I said, did Nadia set me up with the interview that she had just before me? Because it is actually a perfect example of the kinds of dynamics that we're going to be talking about this morning.
Okay, so let's start getting into that. What are the different value systems that you're seeing with each generation?
Well, it's what I'm seeing, but I'm also thanking a man named Claire Graves and a whole bunch of other people before me who did a lot of research on value systems. And I'm going to hopefully make a very complicated topic that's just breaking out of academia now into the populace. I'm going to try and make it simple. And I'm going to review 3 basic value systems. And then I'm going to stop at the end of each one. And if you have any questions, we'll clarify them, okay? So the names that I think people will relate to, and as I go through them, hopefully people will recognize either themselves or their family or their friends. So we call them traditional, modernism, and postmodernism. And so much of the challenge that we're having right now is because we have 3 different value systems happening simultaneously in our culture. And that's basically for the first time in history that we've had that kind of complication. At worst, in the past, we've had 2 different sets of value systems. We actually have 3. So traditionalism is basically the environment that I grew up in the 50s to 70s when I was born in 1960. And in traditionalism, it's all about having a role and following the rules of your role, right? Kids should be seen and not heard. I heard that a lot. Respect your elders. Women should be barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. A man is the king of his castle. Now, do you notice the poet person that you had here earlier? What was the theme of her poetry?
Right, especially in the Sikh community context, but very much the idea of roles and expectations that were very clearly laid out.
Right, and she actually has her poetry labeled as breaking the rules because it's the rules for the roles she was supposed to step into, right? So in a sense, she was embodying modernism, saying this is who I am. These rules don't make sense for me. So traditionalism tends to be ethnocentric, and they have love and compassion, but mostly for their own group. Outsiders tend to be considered threats, either literally, survival type, or at least to your way of life. Right? So you want to keep those boundaries up. You don't want to marry someone outside of your ethnic group because that's going to bring in a different value system and could erode the coherency that we have. Traditionalism also tends to be characterized by black and white thinking. It's sort of us and them, my way or the highway kind of thinking. And it uses shame and guilt to keep people in line. Or if that doesn't work, there's deference to authority. Right? Whether it's the elders or the police force or God Almighty, right? That tends to be a very strong force in traditionalism. So does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I think what would be helpful is if we go through all the 3 ways of thinking and then kind of come back to how that relates to feelings and the way we express them. So that was traditionalism. Let's go to modern.
Yeah.
Next.
Now, the hippie movement in the 60s basically started what's called the me generation and the birth of modernism. It's characterized by challenging tradition and thinking for yourself. And it's based on rationality and reason and logic. So basically, the reason that we got at the Enlightenment left the laboratory and came into culture. People started thinking for themselves. Don't tell me how to think or how to act. I have the right to think for myself, which is what your poet lady was talking about. It breaks away from the ethnocentric morality, and it braces reason to decide that all people, including black people and women and children, should be equal under the law. Right? So it was in the 70s and 80s that women stopped being property of their husbands because that didn't make sense. That was just a tradition that we had to break away from. The other thing that characterizes modernism is achievement, right? It's the individual discovering who they are, often by going out and taking on some big challenge. So be all you can be is the epitome of this value system. Who am I and what do I want? Not what my parents and community think I should be. So when I was growing up, believe it or not, when I decided I wanted to go to university, which pretty much everybody in this culture thinks is a great idea, my parents got upset because I was breaking from the tradition of, we were working class people. My dad was a plumber, so I was supposed to go into the trades, right, or become a farmer or something like that. We see that modernity is really characterized by business and entrepreneurs and professional athletes and musicians, people trying to give voice to who they are. If you look at Winnipeg, we have a huge number of musicians. People are saying, well, this is who I am. I want to know how good can I be, right? How many people will love my music? How far will it go? So this is really about me discovering who I am and where I rate and rank next to other people. It's really about self-discovery and, as I said, very achievement-oriented.
And that brings us to the final kind of part on this spectrum, postmodern. At the risk of sounding too academic, what does that mean?
Well, and I'm going to say that you can see how the stability of traditionalism, because everyone was doing well and had homes and, food and everything was going well, there wasn't a lot of chaos. You could see how that gave birth to the conditions where the children could say, well, but I want more than tradition. I want to know who I am, right? Now, once you embrace modernism and things like, I'm attracted to people of the same sex. That doesn't make sense, but that's how I feel, right? You're breaking from the tradition. So you start to turn inwards and you're embracing your own internal feelings. And you can see now how if you're going to embrace your own feelings, you have to embrace other people's feelings. And that's really the backbone of postmodernism. So postmodernism is characterized by not just tolerating differences, but it embraces and supports differences. So whereas differences were seen as a threat for traditionalism, in postmodernism, differences are honored, right? We really want to respect the individual differences in the fight that people have had to be individuals. So homosexuality and all the gender variations are embraced and welcomed. And while modernism is lonely and self-centered because it's about my achievement and me, finding out who I am, my quest, postmodernism is looking for relationship. Once you've figured out who you are in modernism, postmodern emerges as all the individuals find each other, right? So we've got LBGQ clubs, right, or hangouts in school systems. I joined the Buddhist geeks when I was going through this because there were people who were into meditation and into technology, and there wasn't many of us, right? So as I find my individuality, I want to find other people like me. And basically, in doing that, postmodernism says, well, if we're going to embrace all these differences, we have to find a way to get along peacefully. So if it works for you, that's great, as long as it doesn't take away from the rights of others. Let's agree to disagree on that one, right? These are the kinds of things you hear in postmodernism. Postmodernism tends to be world-centric. It's not nationalistic. It's not patriotic per se. It's not ethnocentric. It's more world-centric. So we're going to embrace all of the world. And it really, as I said, honors interior experiences. What would it feel like to be that person? That's a question that traditionalism wouldn't ask, right? Because you don't even want to know what you're feeling because you have to maintain your role. And I'm hinting at what we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So part of what happens as this empathy for yourself and others emerges, you see you have empathy not only for your own tribe, but for other people and for animals. And as we're honoring our internal experience, you can see that things like forests and massage, like things that give us access to interior experiences, like, say, for example, forests, I can go there and value it for the experience it gives me, whereas in modernity, it's kind of looked at as a commodity. How can I make money from that? So postmodernism really is this sort of step of trying to make sense of all the individuals that are gathering together. We tend to identify people as groups, right? And we see that a lot in, the white cisgendered male or female. People really are seen in the group that they're belonging to, and postmodernism's challenge is to try and get all those different groups to get along with each other.
So this brings us to the conversations that we've been having for a few weeks about emotions and feelings. When you're dealing with people who are coming from all these different worldviews and contexts, and you've gone through kind of a thorough background as to why people think these ways because of the things they were taught, how then does that come out in the ways they are able or perhaps unable to communicate their feelings?
And that's a good point, the inability to communicate feelings. And this is why it's really only in the context of postmodernism that emotions and feelings per se are important. If we look at traditionalism, they knew about emotions. They could say, I'm mad at you. Sadness, on the other hand, if you were really sad and wanted to cry, you had to hide it. And when I was growing up, I heard about people who would have nervous breakdowns. Now, what that meant was that they had been suppressing their emotions and feelings so long that, and they weren't successful at it, that it broke through. They broke down and could no longer perform their role. And literally, people would get hospitalized in mental hospitals because they were crying. Like, just because they had cried all night, and the next morning, it was like the ambulance was called and they were taken to the hospital, and you'd do anything to get them to stop crying and to become functional again. I mean, that breaks my heart to even think about that. And you can see that if you've been suppressing your emotions that long, that by the time you couldn't contain it any longer, you were in pretty rough shape. So you couldn't function. With modernity, you're not so much suppressing your feelings as ignoring them because they get in the way of achieving your goals. If I want to become a multimillionaire, if I want to become an outstanding athlete, well, most of my feelings, my fatigue, and the loneliness, I can't pay attention to because I've got to push them aside to achieve my goals. So in both traditionalism and modernism, we didn't pay attention to our interior experiences because they got in the way of the values. Now, in postmodernism, we actually ask kids, how are you feeling? What would you like to eat? Do you want to stay or do you want to go home? Those are questions that I would never have been asked as a child. It's like, we're eating this, sit down, you don't want to eat it, you're going to bed hungry, right? But now we ask people those kinds of questions. And so we've gone from kind of, as a culture, knowing about emotions to now having to start dealing with feelings, because feelings are those differentiated nuances that create the emotions. And that's why we're having a hard time right now, because we actually don't have a language for our feelings. And that's what I'm trying to do with my bioemotive framework, is to wake people up to the fact that feelings cause emotions. There's different types of feelings. And unless you know what those feelings are, you're going to have a hard time managing all of this emotional energy that's now alive and moving through your body, but doesn't know how to express and resolve itself.
How does that come out in behavior then? When you have you're being asked about feelings and what your feelings, but you don't have the language to do that. What are you seeing?
Well, I'm going to speculate on this. And it is like when I was growing up, we did a lot of alcohol and people were, got into a lot of fights. I think we're seeing less of that in the newer generation and more existential angst. And even in the kids, the ADHD in some ways is because maybe their emotional systems are kept open and they don't know how to deal with all that energy. Right. So it's like by opening the emotional system up, we've created a new set of conditions that we don't know how to deal with. And, my solution and what's worked for, whether you've got alcohol or problems or depression or this extra energy is learning how to find and name the feelings and express them so those energies go away and you're not haunted by them.
In the context of the workplace where you're dealing with people who are senior to you, junior to you, from all different backgrounds, or even at home, right? How do we operate? How do we navigate ourselves to be able to communicate and connect effectively? Not everyone has heard this conversation or is aware about this. So what can we do practically to be able to connect with people from different worldviews?
It's extremely difficult because a person's sense of self and how they make sense of the world is based on the values they have. So I see this with my clientele. They're going home for traditional, Thanksgiving dinner or Easter dinner, and they know there's going to be tension. And part of it is that the different generations have different values. So if as a person, I really honor my own interior experiences and feelings, and I want to connect to my parents. And I say, Mom and Dad, you don't really understand how I feel. Well, asking them to go into the feeling world is antithetical to their survival. They've been suppressing it for a long time. So unless you're really lucky, that's not really going to happen. It's a very difficult thing for people to transcend their value systems and embrace different values. So it's really hard to have those intergenerational communications. It helps if people are highly motivated, and they often are. And so you can kind of start to wean people into it. So it's like little questions like, well, Dad or Mom, how would you feel if someone did that to you? Or can you take a few minutes to think about how I feel? Knowing that it's going to be very challenging for them, but honoring the fact that what they've done is survived and created an environment to allow you to get to the point where you can embrace your feelings.
So meet them where they're at, in a way.
Meet them where they're at if you can, and honor the fact that, these are very complex times and everyone's doing the best they can to breach those boundaries, to go across those gaps in value systems and ways of seeing the world.
These are very complex times, and some people are trying to move forward in order to connect, but we're also seeing this polarization too. What are your thoughts? Are we as a society moving closer together or moving further apart?
Well, up until very recently, I was going, definitely we're moving closer together, and largely because the older generations are losing power and dying off. And so the value systems are changing. We've had so much chaos and unrest, however, in making this move to postmodernism that there's been some regression back to the more conservative traditional values. And so I think we're just having a little bit of an up-down movement, but eventually we're going to all move toward this embrace of the postmodern and, honoring and embracing individual differences and learning how to get along with each other.
Give us one practical takeaway from all of this that we can kind of implement in our day-to-day. Just 30 seconds.
I think it's really about stopping and saying, how does that person feel? If you're a traditional or modernist, that's going to really push your edges. And if you're a postmodern person, asking how a traditional person feels and getting into their eyes will maybe give you more compassion for the fact that they're struggling and doing the best they can too, even if they have a different way of being in the world than you.
Always an insightful conversation, Doug. Thank you so much.
It's been wonderful to be here again, Nadia.
Doug Tataryn is a clinical psychologist and life coach.